Oh, well, warm welcome, everybody. Great to see you all. Happy New Year and all of that, if it's not too late. Yeah, we're still in January, so I think it's okay to say that. I'm very pleased to see you all. Starting this year, we are looking at, well, really following up from our last Salon in December, when we started looking at the positional method of taking perspectives. And then Kristian has very kindly offered to take us through his theories of perspective taking today. And I don't think Kristian needs too much of an introduction since he's been associated with SRAD since, well, he started SRAD actually back in 2011. Um, and then in 2016, he handed over the treasurer job to me, and I still can't get rid of it. So thank you very much for that,
No, thank you.
Kristian. Yeah, I'm still trying. If anybody wants to take over the treasurer job of SRAD, the seat could become vacant. Just apply here. Kristian is a multidisciplinary guy. Engineering, mathematics, and adult development, all of those three. And recently, well, more, I guess, moderately recently, been involved with IDG, setting up the framework there. So he knows about, well, as much about adult development as all of us put together, I reckon. And be very interesting to hear what he's got to say now about taking perspectives. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Kristian.
Thank you, Nick, for a very kind introduction. And thanks, Nick and Bernard, for kind of allowing this space for me. I'm very curious and also a bit nervous to share this stuff. And I'm very also grateful for all the input you have, positive as well as critical. So I'm very much interested in what you have to say about what I have to say, and about the journey that I feel that I have embarked on the recent 5 years, when I kind of started to realize that perspective taking is important. So I will go through I have a presentation. I aim for 45 minutes, and then we open up the space for kind of questions and input and discussions. That's my plan. And I will share my slides. I hope that this works. Is this okay?
It is great.
And this should be, yeah, there it go. This is a piece of art. It's actually mine. And this is called Janus, and it's made by a Swedish glass artist called Bertil Wallin. So it's for me, this represents kind of two phases that we have. One phase kind of approaching out and um, approaching the public sphere and approaching others, and the other phase kind of facing more inwards. So it's, for me, this is kind of a token of perspective taking. I will try to give many examples. So forgive me if I kind of rush through a lot of aspects here. So, but I will start with this one. This is the Emperor's New Clothes. It's from H.C. Andersen's tale. There are previous versions of this as well, but just this is about the emperor that is approached by two con artists, who convinces the king or the emperor that they can make beautiful clothes to him, and with threads that only those can see who are competent in their work. So if you can't see the thread, that means they're implied that you are not competent in what you do. So this has the consequence that no one dares to kind of admit that they can't see any clothes. And until the final, it's a very short story. So in the final, when they kind of walk through the city with it, and he's showing off his new clothes for everyone, and no one says everything because everyone is afraid of what others will say. And famously, the little child who is pre-social and doesn't understand social implications, just states his or her observation, the emperor is naked. And what happens at that point in time, as Steven Pinker argues, is that first, before the child says anything, everyone has knowledge that the emperor is naked. But after the child has said it loud, and everyone kind of it spreads throughout the crowd, then it's not only so that everyone knows that the emperor is naked, but everyone knows that everyone knows. And this is also the title of Steven Pinker's latest book. He just released it, When Everybody Knows That Everybody Knows. And to me, this is kind of a shift in perspective that is kind of induced by this child. And this is, Pinker argued that, or I would say I argue that this way of perspective to understand common knowledge is a basis for democracy. That kind of, there are things that we have to agree. We have to agree on who is president or prime minister or anything like that. So that's why you have big kind of ceremonies to kind of publicly announce so that you can say that this is commonly known now. Everybody knows that everybody knows. So this is Pinker's argument. So this is one example of kind of a shift in perspective. So for me, H.C. Andersen's tale of the emperor is a tale with the core in perspective taking. And here comes another example. And this is kind of the comparison between two games, chess versus poker. And this is an example that is given by Robert Selman, who I will kind of talk a bit about later. And Selman argued, Selman was very interested in social perspective taking. So he compared chess and poker and argued that one of these games emphasizes perspective taking more than the other. And what would you say? What is your reaction? Which one of chess and poker emphasizes perspective? Where do you need more perspective taking than the other? I played the chess, not professional, but kind of on pretty high level as a youth, and I managed pretty well without perspective taking, I could say. You typically you come a far way just by assuming that the kind of your opponent makes the best moves, and you can kind of manage pretty well. Whereas in poker, as Selman argued, typically your cards are concealed so you can bluff. And therefore you need to pay more attention to, as Kai and Igor, as you both said, you need to pay more attention to kind of what does the opponent think here and how does he bluff now or doesn't he? So I would say you need perspective taking in both, but significantly more in poker. And this is also what Selman argued. And also this if we take chess, for instance, when you look at chess, even high-level player, they don't have poker face. When they make a bad move, you really see that they are disappointed in that sense. So they don't try to hide typically much. But I would say if we see that we need two skills here, perspective taking and complex thinking. You need a lot complex thinking in both of them, but a lot more perspective taking in poker. But what we have done now, when we started thinking about, okay, when do we need both? My intention here is to start a process of differentiating them, saying that, because I will make the argument that perspective taking and complex thinking, they are two distinct aspects of human development. That's the argument that I will make. And for me, the latest recent years has been a journey of trying to discerning them. And I see it as kind of perspective taking is how you take in information. Whereas complex thinking, this is what you do with information when you have it, and how you organize information within you. And I think the argument is also made by Immanuel Kant, who had in his critique of pure reason, he argued that we organize the information in different categories, but before that we have what he referred to as transcendental aesthetics, which is how do you perceive them. So that step is kind of how we perceive then information and then how we organize the information. He made that distinction, which I think is useful here as well. A final example is in the overview effect. Cognitive shift reported by some astronauts while viewing the Earth from space. I would argue also here that this is not something from descriptions here. This is not that they organize the information differently, but rather it makes more sense to me to say that you get a new perspective on Earth. You can see Earth from the outside. And also you have the famous Earthrise photography that kind of sparked the movement, the environmental movement. All right, I will go to the outline, but first just some historical roots. When did we start talking about perspective? Well, first of all, the etymology, perspec means to observe through. I think it kind of makes sense intuitively. And prospettiva, that's kind of the art of projecting 3D objects, as you see here in the delivery of keys. And typically this became widespread in the Renaissance, Italy. There's some experimented significantly earlier than this as well, but this is kind of when people started to use perspective as kind of as a word. In the Western world, good, exactly. Because in Chinese there's some I won't go into that, but that's a very good to point out. Okay, outline. First of all, arguing that perspective taking is a distinct and basic aspect of dimension of human development, next to complex thinking. And then I will kind of give most focus to talk about the theory that I'm proposing, and then kind of applying the theory to physical reality, and then kind of starting to discuss a bit shortly just what implications does this have for complex and dialectical thinking. So this there is some I would like to kind of give some credit to Tom Hagström, who in his book Developing Human Mind, I had a lot of discussion with Tom, and he made the case that and which I agree with, that kind of you can't reduce human development to kind of only one dimension, such as complex thinking in different domains. So that's a kind of one strand of adult development stage theories, I would argue. Kind of seeing there is only complex thinking and that takes place we can apply that in different domains. That kind of one strand of the adult development stage theory. The other strand, the second, I would argue, is the one on ego development and meaning making. Kind of Löwinger, Keegan, for instance. And then kind of the strand then that both Tom and I try to promote is that, okay, there are several basic dimensions of human development. And I'm making the argument that complex thinking is one of them, described, for instance, by model of hierarchical complexity, Fisher-Skill theory. Possibly also one way of seeing it's also dialectical thinking. That's kind of one basic strand. Another one I argue is perspective taking. And then that I want to go into here, identity, dealing with identity and action, some sort of it. So you can see it as knowing, being, doing, and perceiving. You can see it like that, but or also ontology, epistemology, aesthetics, and behavior and ethics. So I make the case, and I think that that's the case also that Robert Selman made, that social cognition cannot be reduced to theoretically or practically just to the simple application of cognitive skill to the social sphere. So Selman is saying that you can't reduce perspective taking to complex thinking. It's not complex thinking within kind of different domains of perspective taking, but rather perspective taking is something completely distinct from complex thinking. So that's the case I make. And I will rest there and kind of continue and kind of try to explain kind of what's the problem that I'm seeing. If I now want to explore what perspective taking is, what problem do I encounter in that case? So what I see as a problem here, or kind of the problem that I want, the theory that I will discuss, that I want this to address is the following. kind of is how can we take more advanced perspective on our physical reality? I noted Graham Boyd here. Nice to see. I read your book where you talk about quantum mechanics a bit in relation to complex thinking. And this is also a question that I want to address. Kind of, for me, when I look at complex thinking, then, I mean, we can discuss Newtonian mechanics, but then we are kind of really, we are on cross-paradigmatic according to Commons. So I don't see a clear shift in complex thinking from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics, possibly something about kind of going from formal to dialectical or something like that. So what I want to explore is the shift from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics. Does that represent some sort of shift in perspective taking? And if so, I need to say that we need to some sort of theory for perspective taking that can be applied on physical reality. And then, hence, is perspective taking general across domains? That's because complex thinking in model of hierarchical complexity that can be applied across domains in psychological issues and mathematics and physics and like that. So can you do the similar thing in with perspective taking? And also, is there in kind of a shift from Newtonian to quantum mechanics? So in this, let's see if you see the pointer here. If perspective taking is kind of the general thing that I want to describe, typically those down here, relational reality and psychological reality, this is typically what you call social perspective taking in what Selman referred to as social perspective taking. So I want to kind of see perspective taking on physical reality as well. And you need to talk about kind of perspective taking in a general sense. Some short kind of notes on kind of inspirations from this. So from the adult development perspective, perspective taking as a skill or of stage-wise increasing ability, I refer to these as orders of perspective taking. First, second, third, and fourth, and so on. Person perspective. This is a way introduced by Cook-Greuter, popularized by Wilber. Terry Fallon also uses this in a state theory. However, I argue that no one defines it. What defines what a perspective what a perspective is? Suzanne Cook-Greuter has kind of a pretty good kind of images and kind of figures illustrating the perspectives. However, they don't help me in understanding physical reality. So this is kind of one to, can I formalize this in some way? And of course, Piaget and Inhelder's work I will talk about, and Selman as well. But I would argue that it's still under-researched and underappreciated. And what I see is a tendency that when you get into the abstract and kind of more theoretical realm and of perspective taking, it tends to collapse into complex thinking in different domains. So hopefully we'll give some examples. Just a quick note, just orders. I'm an engineer. It's very kind of discreetly or neatly ordered. Reality is messy, and there are a lot of nuances in this way. So it's idealizations really coming up here. And also, we are in a modern society. We are embedded in more than one order. So it's kind of, we are surrounded in it, which kind of also adds to the motivation of trying to see what is it, what does it mean to take a perspective. And also language is imprecise. So this also has been kind of something that we should note. All right, with this, let's go into kind of the theory. I published this almost exactly a year ago in the Transdisciplinary Journal of Engineering Science. I must admit that I did propose it to some other journals that didn't it didn't resonate with them. But here I did have it published. And what I do is I formulate orders of perspective taking, and the research process is kind of proposing a hypothesized theory and then look kind of in these three aspects of reality, kind of psychological, the relational aspect, and the physical aspect of reality, and see, okay, who writes about perspective taking in this sense? What are good sources here that I compare with? And Piaget speaks a lot about, and Piaget and Inhelder talks about kind of they make physical experiments, And then we have Selman, kind of on up to third person perspective, kind of looking at social and emotional perspective taking. And then Cook-Greuter's ego development theory. However, no one talks about physical kind of understanding physical reality from higher orders of perspective taking than third person perspective, which though it could be argued to be like Newtonian mechanics and Piaget's formal operational. So, and the three domains, if I kind of motivate why these three domains, well, the physical is all around us. We live in a physical world. And also after Descartes, kind of making a clean break between the res cogitans and res extensa, kind of it's the psychological realm or aspect of reality gets properly differentiated. And then the relational with, for instance, Durkheim or Searle. So these kind of, Wilber would call it the big three. So this is why I look at these three, but also there are kind of also where there's data. So this means that I'm not engaging in spiritual aspects, for instance. Okay, so here's the theory, and I can sum it up in one image. It's in one diagram. So it consists of tiers inspired by O'Fallon and Fisher. So there's a concrete tier, there's an abstract tier, there's a non-conceptual tier. And each tier, there are two kind of orders. First person perspective means looking at concrete stuff. Second person perspective, being able of stepping out of that embeddedness and being able to differentiate between the concrete objects and our perception of the objects. And in abstract here, you're looking abstractly at things objectively from a third person perspective. And then fourth person perspective, stepping out of that embeddedness. And then a kind of hypothesized non-conceptual tier. And this is where it becomes quite tentative. And I will discuss this in a moment. Fifth person perspective. And to be frank, I have no idea what a sixth person perspective is. I haven't been near that, but it should look like that if the pattern should be consistent. So it's I want it to be extremely clean and simple in this sense. But kind of behind every of these orders, you can go to the sources like Selman, Piaget, Cook-Greuter, and look what do they write about perspective taking in this. So for instance, in Susanne Cook-Greuter's work, she talks about kind of broad, development in a broad sense, ego development, which includes kind of issues around identity, issues around complex thinking. And so what I look at her description and see what does she say around these stages about perspective taking, and kind of does that make sense when we look at this order. Okay, so let's go. I thought just go through them and give some examples one after one. So first person perspective, just if you want to take a first person perspective, just look around in the world, in the room, just looking at single objects, concrete objects here and now. There's an object, no kind of no larger understanding of how things fit together, but rather just looking at single objects. And psychological world undifferentiated from the physical, and the relational. I mean, what does it mean to be in relation? Yeah, you're at the physical proximity. You're basically at the same place and playing with the same stuff. So if I should illustrate it, it should be like this: just looking out in nature. There's a rabbit, there's a tree, there's a sun. That's it. Part of my journey here is that I got a small grant of roughly 20,000 euros to arrange workshops around this, to kind of invite people to explore different orders of perspective taking based on this theory. And we had the first meeting a few days ago, this last Friday. And this is where we kind of go around and kind of try to feel in first person perspective. So they are kind of toilet rolls that people have and just looking one object at a time. It was quite interesting, very extremely simple exercise, but afterwards people felt a bit more grounded and kind of the energy of the room kind of started to sink, which I think thought that was quite fun. So this is kind of we trying to experience these perspectives. Okay, this is first person perspective. Here comes the second. Three mountain problem. This is kind of from Piaget and Inhelder's work. And in this experiment, you have a child that you want to kind of investigate, and here's you put the doll across the table. If the child can kind of imagine what the doll is seeing from the doll's perspective properly, for instance, that yeah, the tall mountain is kind of at the back, and the kind of lower mountain is at the front. If you can identify this, then you kind of qualify for second person perspective. You can take second person perspective, meaning that you can take another concrete person's perspective. So concrete persons means specific. And I will talk a bit about concrete and abstract soon. All right. So second person perspective, you can see concrete objects with stable properties and durable categories, as Keegan refers to it. And you're stepping out of embeddedness. And Keegan has an example of two children, slightly older and slightly younger, looking. They're at the skyscraper looking down, and the younger one says, "Look at those small people," and the older one says, "No, they look small." So if you can differentiate your perception from reality, then you can take a second person perspective. So that's kind of one of those aspects. And also, in second person's perspective, as the inner reality, you understand that people have an inner life that is distinct from that people have thoughts, opinions, and feelings and intentions, and they can lie, and they can lie, and they can have kind of covert intentions. They can have information that is not accurate. All right, and you can start seeing yourself. So this, I would argue that this is the basis for socialization. So this is the two kind of order one and order two, first and second person perspective. So this is a huge watershed, and here is the next, maybe even bigger watershed than when we go from the concrete to the abstract. So concrete, kind of when I say concrete, I mean specific and particular objects. Tangible here and now, but it can also be yesterday or tomorrow and over there or over there. So it's not only here and now, but it's concrete, so it's specific. Whereas abstract means you deal with universals and generalizations. And it's not, a common way of seeing it is to see the kind of physical world as concrete and the mental world as abstract. That's not what I'm saying. So this another distinction that I'm going with here, and another way of addressing this distinction is to say particulars versus universals. So nationality, space-time, natural laws, for instance. So if we compare this kind of a first-person perspective illustration, what would a third-person representation look like? I would argue like this. So this is, you have natural laws. For instance, you have Maxwell's laws, you have Newton's gravitational law, you have some photosynthesis and things like that. And what has struck me since then is that all kind of physical laws that we have, not only from quantum mechanics or Newtonian mechanics or relativity or something like that, but all laws, physical laws and descriptions, nowhere can you find a now. Now is not present in any physical equation or description, which is kind of interesting, I think, because some would argue that now is all that exists. So something to think about. Third person perspective. So if we go back to the three mountain problem, children that operate from a third person perspective, the second person perspective, around 5 years of age, give or take a few years, then that's when they start to take a second person perspective. What do they do when they take a third person perspective in this situation, which they do roughly around 10 to 12 years of age? Yeah, they make maps. So they make a map of the table, which is an abstract representation of the physical landscape of the table. So you use abstract maps, coordinate systems, you talk about objectivity, and you make hypotheses. And this, I would argue, is kind of from the Western society, this is the ideal of kind of the educational system. This is where we want students to go, typically. And the psychological, how do you understand psychological reality? Yeah, you can understand people's in terms of stable traits and values and attitude, but also a self-observing ego and you understand self as a system. And relational, if we look at the relational, what can you do from a third person perspective? You can say that you can understand that the group is an abstract thing. It's a thing in itself. So it has characteristics, but and you can't do that from a second person perspective. But from a third person perspective, you can understand that you are part of the group, and you can take the perspective as a group. You can say that, okay, what does this organization want? Yeah, this is not in the organization's interest. We need to kind of have incentives and so that people do this and this. So you can take perspectives you can take abstract perspectives in this sense. So objectivity is central, but also you can take different abstract roles, perspectives of different abstract roles, but also take perspectives as groups. And then now let's go to the question of physical reality. I kind of described this shift from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics. And what Newton had to do before he formulated his laws of gravity and his laws of motion is he needed to invent absolute space and absolute time. So he said that, so time is more significant, but absolute space, for instance, here, in its own nature, without regard to anything external, remains always similar and immovable. So it's a reference frame that goes outside everything. There is relative motion if you're kind of on Earth and kind of you have a coordinate system that's moving along with Earth. But here is an objective absolute space, which is it's objective, so it's a third person perspective on kind of physical reality that Newton represents. And this is the basis of his laws, I would argue. And he does the same with time. So this is kind of from a third person objective stance. So if we look at time, absolute time, before that, there is a common notion that time progresses, because things are happening. So time is kind of the abstraction of things that happen. So if nothing happens, then time doesn't move from that argument. So kind of what Newton is he's disentangling time so that time is not depending on things that happen. So it's kind of time becomes this absolute and independent things, and same with space. Right, so fourth person perspective, what do you see? Well, when I kind of grapple with kind of descriptions, and I look at the descriptions mostly from Suzette Cook-Greuter, but also I assume that the theoretical description is accurate. So then I go back to the second person perspective a lot. So if I want to understand the shift from third to fourth person perspective, this should be a similar mechanism that's occurring from the first to second person perspective, when you can differentiate from your perception of the world. Here, I would argue that you can differentiate between your abstract view of the world and the world itself. And more specifically, you can kind of take the perspective on the world and how you take the perspective on the world. I will give a few examples here. Here's a map of Europe, which I would argue is a third person perspective representation of Europe. But if I do it like this, here's another one. So there's two maps, two different abstract maps. And what this invites us to, what I want to invite here, is to kind of first reflect on the object, which is Europe, but also on the subject, which is kind of how we see Europe. And in the left-hand side, you can see Europe as something that is kind of comprised of countries with distinct borders. Whereas on the right-hand side, we see rather it's a web of the European road system. So in this case, kind of these two maps tells two different stories. It's one story of separation and one story of interconnectedness. So a fourth person perspective, I would argue, is kind of giving equal emphasis to the object as to the subject. Because for me, perspective taking, I define that as a relationship between an object and a subject. So the subject in this case is how we interpret reality, and based on kind of cultural conditions and things like that. So going to kind of the question of we talked about Newtonian mechanics and kind of what about quantum mechanics? Yeah, more specifically on Niels Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. More than 2-3 roads in Ireland. Thank you. They are European road. It's not the road system, but the European roads. It could be inaccurate anyway. So, but thank you. So looking at Niels Bohr's Copenhagen interpretations, because this I will argue that you really need a fourth person perspective in order to kind of just start to understand quantum mechanics. It doesn't make sense to kind of to see quantum mechanics from the perspective of this is how reality works. And this is also something that Bohr kind of refrained to. He was agnostic about what we could say about reality. Rather, this is in Karen Barod's wording. Bohr's argument for the indeterminable nature of measurements interactions is based on his insight that concepts are defined by the circumstances required from their measurement. So it's not only that we disturb the object by measuring it, rather we create properties of kind of small particles by the act of measurement. So you can't disentangle the system of the measurement apparatus with the object that you want to measure. So therefore, I would argue that this is kind of reflects a fourth person perspective, because you can only say something about the relationship between the object, which is the particle, and the subject, the measurement apparatus. Yep. So this is the argument I'm making. And this is kind of from the fourth person perspective. And we will leave it at that. And then I will just say a few words on what might happen at a fifth person perspective. And when I wrote the article in the first version, I only had the first 4 because that's what I felt confident with describing. But then I kind of, it's more transparent to say what I intuit around kind of what the fifth order of perspective taking is. So I gave it a shot, but also tentatively. So I describe these as fifth person perspective means to take the subject-object relation and other non-conceptual entities as objects of awareness by means of intuition. Patterns or phenomena that manifest across the vision of subject and object can be recognized. And I will give just one example coming from quantum mechanics. But first, just to kind of a couple of quotes from Suzanne on what she describes in construct aware. She said, as the process of self-awareness and deepens and reasoning becomes further differentiated for individuals at the fifth person perspective, access to intuition, bodily states, feelings, dreams, archetypal and other transpersonal materials increases. And in groups and organizations, they may notice archetypal and group process patterns that elude other observations. So this kind of very scarce descriptions that Cook-Greuter have, I also heard descriptions from her. I hear descriptions for her more about that there's some sort of continuum that is undivided, that we kind of, when we create a concept, we kind of cut it out from the continuum and kind of in the same way. So if this is kind of what happens on an individual, kind of in the psychological realm, and also in a kind of collective realm, what does it say fifth person mean in quantum mechanics or in kind of understanding physical reality? And actually, this is my suggestion. And this comes from Harald Atmanspacher and Dean Rickles, who wrote the book quite recently, Dual Aspect Monism and the Deep Structure of Meaning. And they argue for a kind of a reality that is underlying, it's beyond the kind of mental physical division. So it's something that an underlying dimension of reality from which mental objects and kind of physical objects arise. And they argue kind of with support from several physicists along with Carl Jung. So Jung and Pauli had a famous conversation around this, and they kind of, Jung called it unus mundus, as or in a space, timeless space. This is kind of something that underlies the material world and also the mental. So he would so Jung argues that synchronicity is that kind of when things or this kind of takes place that in that unus mundus, and then it kind of pops out in the physical space as well as the mental, and you see some sort of relation between those that's not really causal. And then we have physicists Eddington and Wheeler, and also Bohm and Hiley. So they all kind of they worked in pairs, and they all from different directions kind of try to make sense of quantum mechanics from some space kind of underlying beyond pre-space time, which I find very interesting. And my intuition, I can't argue more than kind of based on more than that, but my intuition kind of, this for me screams fifth person perspective. So this is all I had to kind of, this is my introduction into the theory. And now I just want to show you one thing, kind of opening up the question, so what? And what are the implications to dialectical thinking? Because when I look at the dialectical thinking framework, for instance, mostly Laske's, I try to look at it in eyes. Are there things here that shouldn't be here? Are there things that are more about perspective taking than about complex thinking and dialectical thinking? And I really couldn't find anything, but that was kind of the questions that I came into. But what I did kind of, a thought that I have been entertaining for quite some times, is the notion of tiers. For instance, abstract tier and the concrete tier, can that be applied to dialectical thinking? For instance, it's not visible in the model of hierarchical complexity, but it's more visible in Fisher skill theory, where you have these tiers, and then you have kind of representation, mapping system, this pattern that repeats itself. So it's kind of in an iterative way. So that's kind of, that reminded, this was a source of inspiration to kind of constructing theory, the kind of theory for perspective taking. So, for instance, this is something that kind of stuck with me when we met in Greenwich, and we had a meeting with around complex thinking, and Michael was there, and Igor, I think you were there as well, and kind of we had this discussion around your work with children, where you argued that, yeah, when we work with children, kind of formal operational thinking, formal thought comes in, and kind of children are natural dialectical thinking, but then formal thought comes in and kind of wrecks things. That was my impression, and also I've been hearing that. And on the other hand, we had Michael Bassages, who argues that dialectical thinking, that's something that goes beyond, that's transformational, and it goes beyond formal operational. So first you have kind of the Piagetian view, kind of concrete, pre-operational concrete and formal operational, and then you have kind of dialectical thinking. So a thought that has stuck with me since then is maybe you have dialectical thinking in the concrete realm and dialectical thinking in the abstract realm. So, for instance, in a concrete realm, Heraclitus, who said that we can kind of, he was kind of one of the earlier dialectical thinkers, but he expressed this around concrete and physical aspects of reality, understanding that. Whereas, kind of in a post-formal, in the Hegelian Bhaskar and kind of and the adult development, typically deals with abstract kind of how thought systems come about and kind of can be more or less dialectical. That's kind of something that I'm throwing out as a suggestion for a discussion starter. So we can come back to that, but I will wrap up here and just kind of try to say something about why am I doing this and kind of what's the point here. And I would argue kind of that perspective taking and meaning making presupposes a view on reality. So rather than, okay, what's your ontology? I would argue, what is perspective taking? What kind of, from which perspectives do you come? And then I would argue that typically in ontology, for instance, scientific materialism, that comes as a consequence from which order of perspective taking you operate within. And this is the thought that I think I've heard it in, for instance, in Wilber's work, but rather I would argue that perspective taking is more fundamental than, for instance, physical reality. All right, I think I'll wrap up there, and thanks for your attention. And also another way of kind of looking at maps is that, yeah, the typical Mercator projection that's sometimes kind of argued to be Western centric and kind of emphasizing the Western in the middle and also the kind of Western world as kind of above. So above is typically associated with better than under. So there are all these biases coming in our map making. So this is one way of illustrating how we can deal with both object and subject. All right, and with that, I think I just stop.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristian. That's got us all thinking and trying to take a perspective on that. In the course of laying that out, Kristian, have you thought a little bit about what enables somebody to move from one order to the next?
If we look at, for instance, when I compare with the Cook-Greuter's work and with the Selman's work, it fits very neatly. It makes me suspicious, but it fits very neatly. And there are two stages of ego development for each order of perspective taking. So it's extremely coarse-grained. So kind of moving from one to the next, that's kind of a pretty big deal. So it's not easy. But this is what I try to do with the workshops. And my take on is, if you have a theory for perspective taking and start thinking what is perspective taking, try to peel things apart and just be aware of that you are taking a perspective. I think that brings you on the way. And kind of being exposed to other cultures as well. And that's also kind of extremely kind of enriching in that sense.
There seemed to me to be a really kind of qualitative difference in terms of the jump from concrete to abstract, and then abstract to non-concrete or non-abstract at the fifth and sixth, which seemed to me to be linked in some way to kind of philosophical worldviews. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of probe you on that a little bit. Is that the way you see it? Because for a lot of people, I think we can see easily the concrete to the abstract, but going beyond the abstract seems to be far more kind of subjective and less easy to define.
I agree. By nature of there being scarce with data, but also the notion of non-concept. I mean, it's hard to find. It's hard to kind of, and also I try to write small definitions of what each order of perspective taking is. And when I put it in words, it's hard. You need to be poets in order to kind of grasp it properly. So it's very, and it gets harder and harder, I would argue.
Yes.
But
Wittgenstein
there
comes to
is a
mind.
quality. I think there is a qualitative shift, and I think there is something that I often hear from people engaged with the stages model, that kind of the shift from, they call it the concrete to the subtle, which I call abstract. That's kind of a big watershed. That's kind of a big divide, and also kind of going from the abstract or the subtle to the next meta, where they argue that people tend to fall in kind of, it's really, yeah, big on a psychological level.
Well, maybe the use of language really kind of anchors you in the abstract perspective.
Yeah,
So you can't really describe the fifth and sixth
yeah,
with language because it belongs to the lower tier.
yeah. Likely so. Yeah, it's challenging, sure challenging.
Excellent. Let me throw open the floor to questions.
Yeah, I teach Newtonian mechanics, and my short explanation is yes, Isaac Newton was extremely high in complex thinking, but not that much in perspective taking or ego development. So conceptually, kind of mathematically, what he does is extremely high in terms of a model of hierarchical complexity. In Michael's assessment, he says it's kind of you mix different several coordinates several paradigms for it to be cross paradigmatics. Yes, I agree with that, but that's complex thinking. That's kind of organizing information, and perspective taking is distinct from that. That's my argument.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if
Yeah,
you, yeah,
yeah. There's a few hands up there, Christian.
yeah.
I can see Jen's got a hand up. Graham's got a hand up. Lily also put a question in the chat. Uh, I'm not quite sure which order to take those in. Maybe.
Well, I'm following Suzanne's work in third, first, second, third, and so forth. And Wilber does the same, as I argue, but also what I would say that Wilber does when I hear Wilber, he uses third person perspective and fourth person perspective more as a kind of a general assessment. He doesn't, in my view, in my understanding, Wilber doesn't properly differentiate perspective taking from kind of general development, ego development, or kind of what kind of a general altitude. That's my understanding. Uh, so when I hear people talk about, yeah, this is kind of fourth person perspective awareness, I hear they are saying something about general about ego development, and that is kind of a measure of ego development. So what I argue for is kind of to probably trying to peel them apart. And I mean you could argue, you could absolutely, as Roman does, you can argue against, first of all, my assessments of, we had a discussion on Kant and also on kind of others. You can argue about my assessment on it, and you can also argue about my theory, the proposed theory, absolutely. So I encourage everyone to kind of start to kind of construct your own way of understanding these. But I think my main argument is to kind of peel apart complex thinking and perspective taking, and to say that understanding what does it mean to take a perspective. Yeah, I think I get it. As I understand Wilber, he uses these kind of first, second, third person perspective in two ways. First, as it's like as a measure of altitude, for instance, in integral spirituality, but also kind of walking through the quadrants. This quadrant is first person, this quadrant is second person. So it kind of mixes a bit. So
Yes,
that's for me. I'm in favor of using the kind of the vertical way of using first person perspective. But what you say there is about the integral mathematics of perspective taking, and I've
yes,
been a bit in that and trying to play with that. What I tend to do is just back out because it's kind of the complexity just goes. I lose it very quickly
I see.
when I try to do that. What I try to do is kind of, okay, you go from second to third person perspective. Okay, what opens up? Then I can you can go down very deep in all of these, but I'm just in kind of doing the first iteration at kind of what opens up here. Okay, you see abstractions here and this, and then okay, let's go to see kind of what new aspect of reality does open up for each of these kind of steps to. Um,
Thank you.
yeah,
I'm on the same page with you.
yeah.
Kristian, do you want to take Jen and then Graham?
Maybe Graham. I think you were first.
Graham first.
That's wonderful to hear. So thanks a lot. Really happy to hear that. Just for those in the chat, I pasted the link to my article. You can find it by Googling, but there's the link if you want to kind of dive deeper. Great to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to hear from you also. Yeah, Keegan's work has absolutely been a source of inspiration, and kind of one of the key mechanisms going from 1 to 2 and from 3 to 4. That's stepping out of embeddedness. So that's kind of recognizes that we are embedded in stuff. Keegan represents to me kind of seeing meaning making as something whole. So subject object, that's kind of represents the perspective taking aspect of it. But he involves also there's a kind of self-other coordination as well, and Keegan has the Piagetian framework of kind of there's a philosophical balance between subject and object. That's what I call perspective taking, and I want to focus on only perspective taking. But I understand also they are intertwined. So it's kind of trying to differentiate, peel it out. I want to put it back together again then later. But I want to peel out that kind of what he refers to as the philosophical balance between subject and object. Then he has the psychological balance between self and other. And then he had kind of a biological balance between kind of individual and surrounding in that sense. So in that case, that kind of I want to peel out one of the aspects. Another difference in respect to kind of objectifying. Keegan has a view of development as kind of you have your subject and then you make it to the object. So the movement in Keegan's dynamics is kind of it's moving from in to out, moving from subject to object. I think I have for me, it's the other way around. When I look at kind of the whole ego development and I look at perspective taking, for me, that's the first step. First, you take a perspective. First, you see something. Then you in turn, you take it in. And then you kind of start owning it and identifying it. And then you start to act from it. So for me, it typically comes in that direction. So it's from the outside and in. So that's kind of a guiding thought that I have when I do my workshops, that first we learn what my perspective is, and then we kind of train the different perspectives, we try to understand them, and then we kind of, how does that make me feel, and how does that change me, and then can I act from it? Rather, because for Keegan, it's the other way around. It's objectifying, it's kind of making it visible. So kind of how development takes place and dynamics, I think it's kind of the opposite there. So I'm not sure if I'm addressing what we're saying, but that's kind of how, because I think it's kind of perspective taking for me, I define it as kind of the relationship between a subject and an object. And for each order of perspective taking, I should be able to say something about the object that I typically see, but also how I see it. Is it with the senses, or is it with my mind's eye? Because kind of when we look at the abstract world, when I look at my room, I project out my three-dimensional understanding of the room and the house and the map and so forth. But it's something that I project out, and I see with my kind of and in chess as well. I don't buy this. For me, it's more now. It's natural for me because I see if I have a bishop, I see the line that the bishop makes, kind of the diagonal line that the bishop makes on the chessboard. I mean, I see these patterns. It's not that I kind of there's something that comes to me in my thought process. Rather, I see it on the board. So I see it with my mind's eye in that sense. So I think that we project out. I have an image that I sometimes use. One second. This one. Sorry. Sharing. So that some things, a lot of things that we see in reality doesn't belong to reality. They are artifacts of how we perceive reality. So it's typical descriptions of our brain being a prediction machine. So I don't see the room, but rather my brain projects the room out because I only see I can only focus on like what's in kind of the toilet roll. Uh, all right, Lily. If you're happy with that, Jan. So for now. I want. There is a lot of what you're saying that resonates, and I want to. What I've been struggling, or not struggling, but I've been kind of exploring is systems thinking. Does that represent? Can I understand? Is systems thinking something that you kind of think about, or is systems thinking rather a perspective? That's something
Well,
that I've been struggling with a bit to peel it out, and I think it can be both. But when you say context setting, for me, it sounds like people are kind of only looking at different phenomena or different things. They don't see the big picture. I would certainly say it has something to do with perspective taking. And I talked to a friend today who had a meeting where he's very in a very vulnerable situation, and there are people who kind of give service to him, and things are not functioning well. So he had a meeting, and then when the meeting started, he expected them to kind of start with asking him, "What's about how is your situation? How do you feel? What your kind of that's setting the context in that sense." But they just, okay, here's the agenda. There's the first point, this and this. This is what we struggle with here. And he was like feeling that
mhm,
why don't they see this? So seems like a similar kind of struggle.
yeah.
But I would argue that I mean, I'm not sure if it's a particular order of perspective taking, but it's certainly about perspective taking. Yeah. For me, what you're describing kind of is really sounds like an act of perspective taking,
Okay.
understanding what other people can't see.
Yeah.
So this really, so that I can agree, absolutely. And also but also the importance of and the challenge. How do we do it? Now, if we see that this person doesn't see? I mean, when we go from first to second person perspective, we can physically move a person. Okay, now this. When I was a kid, I was like 6 years, and I have a neighbor kid, and he said, "Yeah, my right arm." And he said, "No, that's not. That's your." He was standing opposite. "No, that's your right arm. No, this is my right arm. No, this is." And I kind of could physically move and stand next to him and holding the same, so he could kind of see the
Yeah.
transformation taking place before
Yeah.
his eyes. So it's thanks. But as an engineer, I also want to use it. It should be useful, and that's what I'm exploring also. It's how can you teach it, and how can you apply it? So I had one participant just dropped a comment on, okay, I have used this in my daily practice now. So I'm extremely curious on how, kind of, if she could expand, how did you use perspective taking in your daily work? Yeah. Right. Should we turn to Igor? Because I think I kind of directed the question in your direction. And I agree. And I have grappled with this as well. And I agree to your kind of assessment that the more perspectives you can take, I mean, the more considerations you have to make, the more limited to action you can be. So it's much easier to take action when you don't take perspectives.
Exactly.
If we look at for instance, ego development, in if I I'm not sure, and I actually told them, my participants, uh, that if you focus too much on perspective taking, I mean, I assume that some sort of balance should be good. And if I try to assess the world situation, I think many struggle with taking too much perspective, but not knowing what to do with it. So kind of we are strong in the epistemological realm, but not that much in the ethical. Kind of, for instance, climate. We know what the problem is, we know what we should do, but we don't do it because it's hard to take action, because it's really, we are kind of, or in the development goals, we are kind of focusing in the front on the kind of being in perspective and being in cognitive, but in the acting we are weaker. Or so I agree with that. So that's not sure that we are kind of helping in that sense.
A dialectical
Yeah.
task, the coordination of these perspectives. Well, we've run past our standard closing time, so I think we can wind up unless anybody has any further questions. But well, thank you so much, Kristian. It's been.
I have one.
You have something you want to ask
Actually,
us?
yeah, I actually do. There's something that struck me. I've been working with perspective taking for a few years now, and it's just struck me now that in Integral Review, like 10 or more years ago, I published a poem called Subject Object Poem. I try to find it now, but I can try to give it a shot to just read it very quickly, if that would be okay as a kind of a round off here.
Of course it would, Kristian, and but I do feel if anybody wants to drop off, then please feel free,
Yep.
because we're past our
Yeah.
witching hour.
Yeah. Thanks for everyone who've been here. All right. Shall I go? I'll give it a shot. Let's see if it works. Imagine a world with no mirror, no camera nor lake without haze. How would I know what I look like, and where would I look for my face? Would I be fair like the maid in the story, or hideous, a walking grimace? I could try and feel with my fingers, or I could tell from the look on your face. But all that I meet, they are different. Some adore me, some run in detest. Some want me to tell them what I see. Some say that not knowing is best. Now, picture me finding a mirror. At last I can see who I am. I see tears rolling down on my cheeks as I admire the face I will damn. Soon I'm traveling the world with the truth in my hand, showing everyone who they really truly are. Soon I'm hated, haunted, and crying, but not from loneliness. Isn't that bizarre? No, I'm crying because I just realized that the face in the mirror I see is yet another part of my body. If I see it, I know it's not me.
Thank you, Kristian. Lovely poem.
All
Yes,
right. Thanks for listening. I really enjoyed this.
excellent. Well, thank you again. And let me pass back to Bernard. Bernard, should we say a little bit about our next session as well?
Would be my recommendation. Yeah, please, Nick.
Yeah, I think we have a date for Yandevish to talk to us a little bit about how AI and human judgment, um, or rather, why human judgment now is so important in a world with AI, and that will be on the 23rd of February. So we'll get Jan's perspective on that conundrum. Hope you'll be able to attend that one.
And I think I have one last question or request, if I may. I think you shared at the sixth perspective that you were not yet sure if you were familiar with this one. And first, I honor this a lot. And second, it would be really wonderful if you could share the moment you think you're more familiar with this territory. I'd love to hear that from your perspective then. Thank you.